In a world increasingly pushing important conversations into tweets and 15-second sound bites, I want to get to know people who are interesting, who hold opinions and have life experiences that may not be familiar to
Philosophy, history, culture, science, technology, music, art. Makes us all unique. Makes us a podcast.
Hello world, this is the AwokenWord podcast, and I am your host, Anuj. Now, while AwokenWord has been around for some time, I'm pleased to say that this is the first video podcast. So if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, you can both hear and see this conversation. My guest today is Matthew Hoh. Matt is currently a fellow with the Eisenhower Media Network, and he formerly served as an associate director there. Matt is about as eloquent, articulate, knowledgeable, passionate, informed, and deeply familiar with the issues of war as any anti-war activist could ever be. And Matt truly has one of the most remarkable stories of any humans that I've ever had the pleasure to meet. As for today, I decided to try some new tools for recording, which didn't go quite as smoothly as I had hoped. While Matt's voice and image comes across perfectly clearly, he really does have a voice for radio and a face for prime time. My audio, on the other hand, comes across a little bit glitchy at points. But it really doesn't matter, because this conversation is not about what I have to say. It's really about what Matt shares. Now, Matt has been on many podcasts, many media outlets, many interviews. He has spoken and written extensively on current affairs, on world events, and our moment in time right now. We, of course, cover a lot of that in this conversation, but I really wanted to go behind the curtain. I really wanted to understand the human, the mind behind the man, and what really drives Matt and what brought him to where he is today. Matt really does share a lot about both himself as well as the world as it is right now that perhaps I had never heard anywhere else before. Now, as you enter into this conversation, which I will let you know is heavy, just know that I believe most people are genuinely and inherently good. They want others to live in peace and justice and harmony. But I also don't need to tell you that we are very far from that goal. And we've got a lot of work to do as a species. There is nothing that I can say here and now that would be more eloquent or more impactful than what Matt shares. However, I would like to say that men like Matt give me hope for mankind, and humans like Matt remind me that the pulse of humanity is still alive. So Matt, thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service to humanity. I really do appreciate the time that we had to spend together. I would like to say a massive thank you to the thousands and thousands of people that have supported AwokenWord since day one. If you're one of those people, you have my deepest appreciation. And for those who might be new to AwokenWord, if you like what you're hearing here, please subscribe, please follow us, and please spread the word. We really, truly are trying to bring a grain of sand of goodness to the beach of human conversation. Conversation is our tool to move forward together. And now, without further ado, I give you my first video podcast and my conversation with Matt Hoh. Welcome to the AwokenWord podcast. I am joined today by Matt Hoh. Matt, I'm really happy to have you here today. I first actually came across you on Judge Napolitano's podcast, and I think it actually followed a conversation that he had with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And that led me down the rabbit hole of asking myself, who is this Matt Hoh? What is he talking about? Since then, I think I've listened to several podcasts that you've been on, Unauthorized Disclosure, the Armenian News Network, read your Substack, and I found your story extremely compelling. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today. I want to understand you as a person and your story and how we kind of ended up here. But you are, correct me if I'm wrong, the director with the Eisenhower Media Network.
Associate director. But
Associate director.
I appreciate your confidence in me and being able to be the director, though. So I appreciate
All
that.
right. Well, there we go. We got a nudge here. And you've been an active Marine. You've been in combat. You've also worked at the State Department, and you have seen war from many different angles and many different altitudes. And that's certainly something that I want to get into here. But let me pause and turn it over to you. For those who may not be familiar with you, Matt, who are you and how do we find ourselves here in this conversation?
Well, thanks, Anuj, so much for having me join you. Yeah, as you described, I was in the Marine Corps. I was in the State Department. I was in the Iraq War twice and the Afghan War as well, and have spent the last 15 years of my life trying to right those involvements, right? So I've spent the last 15 years of my life trying to do something to, I don't want to over dramatize it, right? Or make it too heavy, but to make good or make up for what I did, and that comes in a host of ways. I know you want this to be like a personal discussion. So, I mean, a lot of it is based upon my shame, my anger at myself for going along with those wars, for going back to Iraq a second time, right? For thinking that maybe Afghanistan would be different. Maybe the Obama administration would be different and going to Afghanistan in '09, right? So the anger at myself, the shame, right? The regret at having to do that fuels a lot of what I do and why I do this. I mean, there's other things. Certainly, for the most part, my work is foreign policy commentary and analysis, which if, I met my 17-year-old self, that kid would be so excited that this is what I'm doing. This is what he grows up to do. Right. I mean, because I was a huge nerd about this stuff when I was a kid, when I was 12, like the biggest thing for me, besides like the New York Mets, was like getting a copy of the New York Times, right? And
Right.
having all that information, right? All of what's going on in the world. You know what I mean? So the idea of having this job where essentially, just to talk, to read the news and then talk about it. Yeah. I mean, I am very grateful and very lucky to be here, but that is just one aspect of why I do it. And so it's also work that I believe in, this idea that there has to be an alternative. There has to be somebody or some organization who speak against policies that they believe are wrong, that they know are wrong because they took part in those. I mean, one of the things
Right.
that I think it's difficult for me to let go of any of this is I know many of the people in government. Like I know I've been in these rooms. I've briefed Tony Blinken, and certainly I think for people who understand this, if you also know the type, right? So I'm sure there are people who may be listening who are part of the tech industry, who are part of manufacturing, who are part of academia. You know what I mean when you know the type, right? So maybe you
Right.
don't know exactly that guy. You've never met him before. You've never met that woman before, but you know the type. And so I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of anger that motivates me as well. And, why I do this work is, and I did write a piece last spring for Memorial Day, titled it "The Morality of Anger and Guilt." And that's on my Substack. And if people are interested, they could certainly go look at that.
I want to get to the guilt in a moment because that's actually, I think, one of the things really unique about your work, right? But what compelled you to join the military was the
I joined the Marine Corps after college. I mean, there's a longer story to it, but essentially because I was bored, essentially because I
Mm,
wasn't doing something bigger than myself. I had a good job coming out of college. I was doing finance at a financial operations at a publishing company, working right downtown Boston, worked right in Copley Square. If people are familiar, if people remember, the FAO Schwartz toy
right.
store was in my building. So the giant FAO Schwartz bear statue was right outside. I mean, like, for a 22, 23-year-old, this should have been fantastic. I was living with my friends. We play wiffle ball and drink beer every day after work. I mean, like it should, but it wasn't enough. And I was deathly afraid that I was going to become 40 years old and never have done anything serious with my life, right? Never have really challenged myself and never had taken part in something bigger than me, never have been part of, the big movements of history. Right. And I think looking back, of course, you look at that 12-year-old kid reading the New York Times, of course, he grows up to be somebody who wants to be involved in all that. And so that was the primary motivation for me joining the Marine Corps. I wanted to be a firefighter. My father had been a firefighter, but at that time, this was like 1996, fire departments were either not hiring, or I had just missed a test, or you had to move someplace and live there for 2 years before you could take the test. Like, so one day I saw in the
Right.
newspaper an ad for the Marine Corps officer programs, and, gave them a call. And 8, 9 months later, or however long later, I was at Quantico, Virginia, going through officer candidate school. And that was January of 1998.
So the boredom factor, the wanting to do something bigger than yourself with your life, those all make sense. Was any part of this growing up and believing in a certain myth in terms of what it meant to be the world leader, what it meant to be American, what it meant to be to shape the world? Was any of that part of the story in your mind at that point?
Later, as I become an officer, the idea, and as I'm like a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, the idea of being an officer of the empire, if you will, becomes very attractive. There's a concept within the Marine Corps, whether it's conscious or subconscious, of being modern day legionaries,
Mm,
being those who go out and you're on the borderlands and you're protecting civilization from barbarism, if you will. There's a train of that runs through the Marine Corps, as well as beliefs through the other service as well. And it's persuasive, particularly when you're young, and it's new to you. And I guess you believe in things that maybe, there's a naivety to it. I think, I had certainly had interest in the military growing up, and I had the propagandized experience that most of us have. The United States is a force for good in the world. The United States needs to be the world's policeman. We may do things wrong, but our intentions were always good. And so even if you put down in front of somebody that, the idea of the conquest of North America, the genocide of the Native Americans, enslavement of
mhm,
Africans, build all that up, introduce expansion overseas with Hawaii, and then the Spanish American War, of course, the Mexican American War from the 1840s, and on and on and on, Central America, et cetera, go all the way through, up through Vietnam, up through Central America again. Right.
right,
And then, it would be, well, those were all mistakes. Those were all errors. Those were all done with good purposes behind them. And I think I had that. I also had this understanding, or this belief, that we were in a new world order. So when I graduate high school, it's spring of 1991. My freshman year in college, December of 1991, is when the Soviet flag comes down at the Kremlin. And
right,
so we were in a new world order. You'd also seen the first American-Iraq War take place that year as well. So you had these two events that really did triumph or herald a new world order. And so I think for those of us who had historical understanding, there was an idea that things were going to be different. And I think every generation thinks that. I think every generation thinks
right.
that things are going to be different. They're going to be different than previous generation. The ills, the sins, the evils of humanity, they're divorced. Those are in the past. I think that's what we had. And so, like my entrance into it, I think, was very naive. It was historically grounded, and I think the turning point comes for me before the Iraq War, before the 9/11, even, because of the books we're required to read in the Marine Corps. And this is no longer the
Mm,
case with the Marine Corps, but we still exist, but it doesn't take the same form, or doesn't take the same purpose or integrities, word I'm looking for, I guess, as previous
right,
reading lists did. So you had what's called the Commandant of the Marine Corps reading list. And this was the books that, Marines were supposed to read based upon your rank. And the books were incredibly critical. They were very severe critiques of the United States foreign policy, of United States war making, of the Marine Corps itself. I mean, there were a few hagiographies in there, right? And there are a few motivational type of things, or triumphal books. But by and large, these were serious professional critiques. We also had to read a large number of authors who were our adversaries, who were enemies. So we were supposed to read Che Guevara. We were supposed to read Mao Zedong. We had two books on the reading list from General Giap, the Vietnamese general who, of course, defeated us in Vietnam.
This is actually the first time I've ever heard about this, and quite surprising. Like, what was the rationale to put
that type of reading in front of Marine? What was thinking?
It extended throughout the entire Marine Corps. So it was to have a Marine Corps that was composed of critical thinkers. People often think that the military is very robotic, automatons, and that there's very little dialogue, debate, discussion in anything. And that's not simply the case. I mean, the way that planning in the Marine Corps is supposed to work, there is more back and forth than anyone should ever have to be subject themselves to, right? If you go through what's called MCPP, the Marine Corps planning process, it is, and the idea is to ensure a consensus is reached before a commanding officer makes a decision, so that that commanding officer is making the best decision possible. And there's also a history of the Marine Corps being innovative, forward thinking, and you also too, you want, again, the perception, I think, in the military is that no one does anything until they receive an order. And that's not the case. The desire, the textbooks will tell you, we want people to practice initiative. We want people to move without direction. So that was a lot of the books, was to inspire, and in particularly on to inspire that type of spirit, right? As well as to give the confidence to do so and the authority for people to do it. Look, this is what now in practice, how does it work? Marine Corps is a huge institution, 175,000 Marines, 175,000 men and women. So of course it's not going to work just like any institution, particularly a massive institution like that. It's not going to always work that way. It's probably rarely going to ever work that way, but that was at least the principle, right? So what occurs is, and I'll still cite these two books now. If you were to ask me, what two books should I read to understand the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, from a national strategic level, from like, how did we get here? Why did we stay kind of thing? I'll recommend two books about the Vietnam War, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan's A Bright Shining Lie. And so what occurs then is that because I'm reading this before, again, this is before 9/11, it's causing me to think, right? And I'll also say I'm very blessed and very grateful because I went to a very good public high school. I went to a very good private college, and I had teachers and professors who taught me to think critically. Anyone who slams liberal arts education, fine, you're going to not have critical thinkers then, right? Like that type of thing, right? So I think I was prepared because of the fortunate educational experiences I had to accept what the Marine Corps was giving me as ways to think openly, and very seriously about issues that we were going to be facing. And so when the wars begin, and this is why I'm so angry at myself for going along with it, because I didn't agree with them, right? But you lie to yourself, right? And so you say, well, I'm a junior guy, and if I don't agree with it, by the time I get to be a senior guy, then I'll do something about it. I just need to get experience now. And what the hell do I know? Like that. You just make these lies and these rationales and excuses one after another. And when one of those falls apart, another one pops up. Well, I'm a really good officer. I'll bring my Marines home. That guy over there is not going to do that good of a job. Like that type of stuff. So one lie after another, one excuse, one apology, more rationale, and that causes a massive psychiatric, psychiatric harm. Something I dealt with and many other veterans deal with. Just as an aside, it's understood. There are study after study after study. The VA won't touch this, even though the VA has published a lot of these studies themselves. But it's well understood at this point that the most significant contributor to combat veteran suicide is combat related guilt, what's called moral injury. That's well understood. I could point you to 36 studies on the online library of National Institute of Health, right? PubMed, that will show you this, right? And they've known this for decades. 1991, the VA does a study that says the best indicator of suicidal intention in Vietnam veterans is combat related guilt, right? So anyway, so when I have my doubts about the wars, what are we doing here? This doesn't make sense. I've got this to fall back on to give me the confidence that, you're correct. Right. And this gets into this issue, then a dissonance that occurs within me of knowing one thing, but continuing to do something else it's almost essentially like a right brain, left brain.
Right. That seems to be a typical characteristic of the human condition. In your case, I think it maybe manifested itself in combats and in war. In other cases, it might manifest itself in the things that people are doing for a living. or the choices that they make. And that you can't run from yourself, right? I mean,
Right.
you can tell a lie to the world and then you can cover it with another lie and another lie, but ultimately you can't run from yourself. I just like to juxtapose what you're doing today with your proximity to this. However, like a lot of people today feel we should be well past war. We should be
Mhm.
well past the type of mayhem and violence that we're seeing day to day, particularly in the last year and a half. Uh, However, I'd like to maybe just understand, like, you've been on, I believe, 2 combat tours in Iraq, 1 combat tour in Afghanistan. And could you just talk a little bit about your action in war?
Technically 1 combat tour and 2
Okay.
diplomatic tours. Both of my diplomatic tours, though I was not at the embassy in Baghdad or Kabul, I was with ground forces. I was
Okay.
with the 1st Infantry Division in Iraq, and then later in Afghanistan was what was going called the Provincial Reconstruction Team. We lived right in the middle of a city. So that first diplomatic tour, I actually did carry a weapon, but the Afghan one I didn't, but certainly got, you're there. So things are
Right.
occurring. And this is something I don't think people understand about the Iraq and Afghan wars. And they do surveys. The VA does surveys. The RAND Corporation has done surveys. Other organizations have done it. The universities, what have you. And it's clear that the 9/11, the post 9/11 generation, the Iraq and Afghan war veterans saw more combat than, I shouldn't say that, more Iraq and Afghan veterans saw combat than any other previous generation. So the numbers for the Iraq and Afghan veterans who saw combat is well over 50%. Now, how much did they see? Was it sustained? Was it just one time a rocket came near me? That's all right, debatable. But we do know that going back through the Second World War, no percentage of veterans have experienced war or combat as Iraq and Afghan war veterans, including you look at World War II veterans, it's not even, it's somewhere around 40% or so saw combat, so the prevalence of the experience is something that, this country hasn't really seen before.
The book called Tried by Sebastian Younger. I don't know if you've read it, but I came across it and it just made a whole bunch of things click in my mind. Uh,
Yeah, but I mean, and I'm familiar with Younger's argument. I'm familiar with the book. I actually have written something for the Columbia Journalism Review, going through that book, and then because of my health, I had to stop doing it.
mm,
But his book is without evidence. He offers nothing other than
okay,
anecdotes. If you look at the book, there's no footnotes, there's no notes at all. It's just a bibliography section at the end. And if you actually go and look at, which I did, if you go and look at the things he cites in the bibliography, they're opposed to what he's actually stating. He posits at one point, and he had an issue, they had to recorrect it. His whole fundamental thesis of the book was essentially that half of American veterans are from Iraq and Afghanistan are claiming PTSD, which is not correct. So even like his numbers were incorrect. His assertions at other times about how 9/11 brought the United States together. Go and look at the FBI data following the 9/11 attacks, the number of hate crimes in the U.S. If you look at the graph for hate crimes, I just looked at this for something else, but you look at 2001, there's a massive, massive spike in hate crimes following 2001. His argument is essentially that this generation is different than previous generations of veterans, and that's simply not true. That's simply not true.
mm,
I mean, you had the psychiatric toll of war is massive. And it's, certainly coming back and integrating is difficult. But why is it difficult? It's because there's a huge psychiatric toll that was taken. During the
right.
Second World War, the Army, just the Army alone, not which at that point included the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, but not the Navy and Marine Corps. They were putting into psychiatric hospitals 350,000 men a year during the Second World War. During the discharge rate in the Marine Corps and the Army was between a quarter and 40% for psychiatric discharges. I mean, the toll of this, so you go back after the First World War, go back, look at the Civil War. You look at the contemporaneous records we have, the literature following the Civil War, right? And it is full of references to veterans killing themselves, drinking themselves to death, dying of overdose, dying of exposure. I mean, the toll of war is massive. So this idea that he particularly has that this generation is somehow different and it's the modern era and everything else is just completely unfounded. It has no evidence. Sure, there's people who are struggling with transition, but if that was the case, then why isn't there always a struggle with transition when people get out of the military? That's where the link's not shown, right? If it was just a
Right.
question of reintegrating back into society, then okay, then shouldn't happen during peacetime. And so the argument then is, well, it's the war. They get so much purpose out of it. And I don't know. I was just with a couple of guys. We did a thing up in DC where we met with Iraqis. 4 veterans met with 4 Iraqis, and we had a conversation. And these guys to my left of me, they all murdered Iraqis in cold blood. Absolutely murdered Iraqis in cold blood. That was the experience. It was organized murder. And so,
Mhm.
the idea that they've come home and that they've been shattered for the last 15, 20 years of their lives because they can't reintegrate. People don't understand what they're going through. The war was such a big purpose in that life. And now as a whole, it doesn't add up. And again, there's not the evidence. If you look at, and Younger has this in his book about how there's no evidence about suicide being connected to combat, when again, it's not connected just to the Americans. There are studies from the Balkans. There are studies out of Israel. There are studies. If you talk to the Vietnamese have the same type of suicide epidemic, right? Among their
Right.
combat veterans. And this goes against the whole idea of war serving some kind of purpose. Well, look, if World War II veterans were killing themselves because of what they took part in, right? And they were killing themselves in their 80s. So in 2010, the state of California, along with the VA, does a study of World War II veterans in California. And they find World War II veterans are killing themselves at a rate. These are guys in their late 70s, 80s, right? In 2010. World War II veterans are killing themselves at a rate 4 times higher than their peers. So what, 8 decades, 7, 8 decades after the war, these guys are still killing themselves, and they fought the good war. They're killing themselves
And
because of
is
what they did to Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And the same with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese government
right.
really suppresses this because this runs counter to their narrative. And I agree with their narrative. They fought a war of national liberation. I agree with that. But the reality is that warfare, the psychiatric toll it causes, the emotional toll, the spiritual toll it causes on people is devastating, whether it was good or bad war. And I think that's something that is really difficult for this country to accept. It's politically toxic. No one's touching that. The fact that we sent these guys over there and now they're coming back and they're blowing their heads off because they feel bad about what they did over there when we were the good guys. I mean, I just saw even with the Pete Hegseth nomination hearing, that disgrace,
Right.
right? But I saw Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York, the way she talked about the Iraq and Afghan wars, she referred to everyone we were fighting over there still as terrorists, right? Like the idea that we weren't fighting a legitimate insurgency, we weren't fighting a legitimate resistance. When we know our own intelligence reports, because I've read these things, would tell us these people are fighting us because we are occupying them, right? And that's the
Right.
whole thing, right? I mean, so there's that resistance to that, and then just one more aspect on it: the dissonance then causes further harm to the veterans. So you come back from the war, you're feeling guilt about things, you're feeling shame, regret, or maybe you just don't know how you feel about it, but you're uneasy with it. And you go to a hockey game, you go to a baseball game, and they tell you to stand up, and so everyone could applaud you, right? And so now you're being told to stand up, and you're applauded for something that you feel sick about, that you don't feel right about, that you have shame or
Right.
regret or remorse over, right? So that dissonance then causes that mental, emotional, and spiritual harm to further develop.
That makes a lot of sense to me. What I would say to that as a layperson, as a civilian, that actually gives me a lot of hope. If that makes sense, because it means that the human heart is still functional,
Right.
that people can go through these types of experiences, and however they might cope with it, somewhere deep down, it is not reconciling with the best angels of their nature.
Right.
And it could be for a few weeks. It could be for some decades, as you're talking about in the case of some of these World War II veterans. You've experienced war. You've seen the theater of actual war. Then you've seen the pretend theater of geopolitics and how war is spun, the media narratives that are put on top of it, and how removed or disconnected those might actually be from poor reality on the ground. At the end of the day, war is still happening, but at least I believe, because there's still something flawed in the human heart, not all people, but some people. Wh- This is kind of a big question, but
Mhm.
what do you think is the root cause of conflict and war, at least at this scale?
I think a lot of it's desire. It's political want. It's megalomania, right? It's certainly there are commercial aspects to it. There's a greed to it. There's a desire for resources. But if you look at a lot of the wars that we fight, it's political. It's political. I mean, you could make explanations for these wars that relate to, again, commerce or money or land. You can say, oh, World War II was all about Hitler wanting Lebensraum, right? Living room,
Mhm.
I mean, and there are elements to that. He certainly said that enough, certainly there was that desire for a greater Germany. But like we get back to it again, it's political. And I think it comes back to our evolution or societal evolution and the great fear of the other and how easy that is to arise in people. Hermann Goring, who was the head of the German Air Force and, very, very senior member of Hitler's inner circle, at the Nuremberg trials, he was asked about this. And he said, yeah, of course, nobody wants to go to war. And I'll paraphrase, I'm not going to get it right.
Sure.
But nobody wants to go to war. But what you do is you tell people that they are at danger, that and that those who are opposing the war are unpatriotic and that they're in league with the enemy and the people will come around. And he said it works in a democracy or in a fascist rule, works every time. And it's true. I mean, I think that's one of the ways that war is not just built in terms of public support, but also sustained. There's always two elements to it: fear mongering and moralizing, right? And that plays onto this idea of that over there are dangerous, they're bad, we here are good. And wars are always framed as self-protection. I mean, I don't know, it'd be
Right.
hard pressed to find a war, right? Where they said, we're doing this just because we hate those guys, we're going to kill them. It's always expressed, I should say always, but like mostly expressed, right? As self-protection. Even the most we'll just say with the most egregious example, right? With Nazi Germany, it was
Mhm.
self-protection, right? If we don't invade Russia or Soviet Union, they are going to invade us. I mean, that type of thing. I mean, look at say the Vietnam War, the construct of that for the Americans is that we're defending, right? And the reality was in that case, we're keeping we're inheriting the French Empire. So we're inheriting its interests and that's what we're going to go forward with. But I mean, the capacity for human beings as individuals to take part, it's incredible. Like as a colleague said about his actions and a colleague said about his actions in Iraq, my capacity for sadism still amazes me, you know,
Mm.
wasn't some guy who grew up as a kid hurting animals or beating up his younger brother all the time or something like that, but once the it was there. And once those
Right.
key fundamental roots of who we are were touched and that desire to protect yourself, well, not just yourself, but protect those around you, right? And how that develops into not just something where you're acting out of fear, but you're acting out of anger and a desire for vengeance, right? And so it
Right.
is. I mean, it's something that has been with humankind forever. And I'm sure it comes from the very beginning when one small group of our humanoid ancestors would attack another small group and take their berries or whatever, I
Right.
mean, and it grows from that. And then we become, we're a political animal. You look at recorded history, and this is throughout our recording history, not warfare, but that we are are political, that we are a political species, right? Just in all sorts of
Right.
ways.
One of the things that's really, I've been reflecting on this a lot. This isn't just war. This is pretty much anything where there's two or more people involved in it. But the most powerful and the single most dangerous weapon in any war is actually the story that we tell
Yes.
ourselves and each other to start that.
Right.
We are the chosen people. We are an oppressed people. We are a supreme people. We are defending our land. So there's a base reality, which may or may not actually compute and agree with that story. But ultimately, you have to tell yourself a story. And whether or not you believe it, you have to get enough other people to believe it to be able to take what's really the most serious and life altering action that one could possibly take, because you're literally putting yourself in harm's way, sometimes voluntarily. And it all starts with a story. And I wonder why it is that we allow ourselves to fall victim to these stories over and over. Why it is that we allow what's obviously in many cases just puppet mastery. Like you can
Hmm.
see if you
Right.
followed the story, if you followed the money, if you followed any of the chain of events, you can see how we ended up here. If you did even 5 minutes of thinking about it. And yet we fall to it over and over. And I'm not sure that we've gotten that much wiser today than we were 100 or 200 years ago. Yeah, that's just it's something I've been reflecting on.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's pretty profound. And I agree with you that the story, the narrative is the most important. I think the ability of people to respond in a fashion that is predictable is something that those in power oftentimes count upon. So if you're going to
Mm,
look at, say, following 9/11, what the Republicans were given in the sense that the Republican White House was given the sense of this is now our mandate from the American public to do as we want, right? And then, of
right.
course, you see the buildup for the Iraq War. Karl Rove, who was George W. Bush's senior political advisor, very famously said, "Wartime presidents get reelected." And I can tell you the same thing
Right.
happened in 2009 with the Obama administration. One of the things about me, just for people who are listening, I had very Forrest Gump-like experiences. I ended up at very senior places, even as a junior guy. So I was in and around senior levels at the Pentagon and the State Department just because, just because I happened to be there, right? I mean, like,
You just kept
can't
running.
well, I mean, in sense of getting the Pentagon, and I got to the Pentagon in October 2002, and I ended up being I was a junior Marine Corps officer on the Secretary of the Navy staff. So low level guy in a high level position, saw a lot, heard a lot, learned a lot, right? And why I got there, just as an aside, was because I was stationed in Okinawa, and every day I got into a fight with this. I was a captain at the time, and every day I got into a fight with our battalion executive officer. And every day I just wake up thinking, what am I getting into a fight about with Major Fontenot about? And I'm sure it was the
Mm,
same thing for him. I'm sure he was the same way. What time of the day are Captain Hoh and I going to get into a fight, right? And so what happened was, what called a hot fill showed up in his email. We need someone to go to Washington, D.C. like right away to take this job because there had been like a vacancy there. And so,
okay.
yeah, he called me and said, "Hey, you want to go work in DC?" I was like, "Yeah." And then he was like, "All right." And then a week later, I literally was heading to DC. So it kind of like that type, one of those stories where somebody hating me, right, and I hated him back, ended up being a major fulcrum, a major turning point in my
Right.
life, right? And so that's why I say it's kind of Forrest Gump like because things just happen. But you certainly the ability of people to respond predictably in the way towards war. And this is what you see. You see in American wars, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, the public opinion is very high at the beginning of the
Right.
war, right? And then when the reality of the war takes hold, when it's clear immorality cannot be hidden, and oftentimes the lies and the obfuscations and the falsities that drove the war and then are sustaining it the public opinion, right, falls out. And you see that with Korea, you see that with Vietnam, you see that with Iraq, you see that with Afghanistan. And
Right.
so, the with warfare, the need to continue that puppet mastery, as you called it, is clear. All foreign wars have a political price. They all do. There's always a domestic political cost of foreign wars, no matter who you are. If you go back to the Romans and look how they dealt with it,
Right.
like in the sense of how they had to continue to appease their people. And, one of the reasons why they don't allow the legions back into Rome is because they don't want these legionaries telling the Roman people what's really going on. I mean, that's one of the
Right.
things. Other aspects too. They don't want the legions to take power. Oh, there's all kinds of reasons for it, but that's always been my kind of understanding is like, we don't want these guys talking about what's going on up there in Germania or what's going on out there with the Parthians. We don't want to hear, that's not share that information too broadly.
So you end up in this Forrest Gump like situation in DC, and you obviously had some some convictions and thoughts in the back of your mind all throughout your career at that point already. I imagine that what you saw in DC was a little bit of it may have been somewhat of a surprise, maybe more so than you expected, but I'm curious how many other vets that you've come across share this perspective, the critical perspective.
Well, I mean, certainly we know from public opinion polling that more veterans of the Iraq and Afghan war view the wars as mistake or worthless or an error or whatever the poll question was than do the American public. The last time I saw this asked was fall of 2021 after the U.S. Retreat, departure from Afghanistan, the Taliban victory there, and the poll numbers were like 70% of veterans of those wars felt the wars were worthless or shouldn't have taken place, or again, whatever the poll question was. So I was in the Pentagon in the Secretary of Navy's office for the first year of the Iraq War. So I got there of October 2002. I was there in April 2004 before I went to Iraq. And every now and again, I get an email from a friend of mine who was in Iraq, who was, basically the line was, hey, you're in the Secretary of Navy's office. Can you tell us what the hell is going on? Like that
Right.
kind of thing, right? So
Right.
I think there was always there's that suspicion that was there. For me, I got to say, personally, the war became very personally, very quickly for me. One of my jobs there in the Secretary's office was I was the Marine Corps' White House liaison officer. So I dealt with the White House on behalf of the Marine Corps. And I think he was the second Marine who was killed over in Iraq in 2003. The condolence letter from President Bush was returned to the White House for a bad address. And so, of course, that didn't go over well. And my boss, who was the executive assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, said, hey, Captain Hoh, from now on, you're going to call every casualty officer and make sure the address is correct. So I did, and here I am, this guy calling down for the Secretary of Navy's office, talking to these other captains and majors who are dealing directly with the families of those who were killed. And I don't confirm the address. And then I say, hey, man, anything I can do to help you out? And over again, I would hear, yeah, actually there is. And what had happened was the Marine Corps casualty process was completely broken. But one of the many issues with the war was that the war or the lead up to the war was that the war was supposed to go splendidly. And by the summer, we were going to be down to 30,000 troops there. And the
Right.
Iraqis were going to greet us with flowers, right? And, on and on and on. And so being generous as to why this occurred, but the Marine Corps Casualty Office, the office, say, had 5 people. The war was March 17th, right? Or March 18th, whatever it was.
Right.
March 17th, they had 5 people. On March 18th, they had 5 people. On March 19th, they had 5 people. They didn't plus up the casualty office. They didn't prepare at all because they were being told, no worry to, no big deal. There might be some casualties in the beginning, but then it's going to be easy sailing, right? And so the casualty office, which, it deals with a Marine who kills himself riding a motorcycle, right? A training accident, a Marine who has a heart attack or whatever, ones and twos and stuff like that, now was dealing with this. And they just made incredible errors that deeply, deeply hurt and harmed families. I could do a whole big, anyway, I could find a letter I wrote to the secretary about it, but it was even people probably familiar with the stories from the time about how Marines at Bethesda who were wounded, who were receiving bills for their medical care, right? Their family was receiving a bill for their medical, right? I mean, it's like, how is that possible? That's just the
Right.
tip of it. That's just the top of it. Like the stuff that occurred was really ugly, and families to this day are still angry, I have to believe, over how they were treated after their kid was killed or their husband was killed or father was killed in Iraq. So before, let's just say I was dealing directly with families of dead Marines right away. And so it became very personal for me as well. But I think that the idea for me too was, so I saw the way the bureaucracy handled it. And I saw the way that people were being harmed in that manner outside of the battlefield, right? And so again, it became very personal. And for me, like on a more intellectual policy type of strategy thing, I never thought the Iraq War made sense because Saddam Hussein was contained. He wasn't doing
Right.
anything. What's he gonna? He's gonna give a can of mustard gas to some terror group so that we can come in and level Baghdad. He's gonna offer up that gift to us, right? That makes no sense. I mean, so as well as he got this whole Afghanistan thing, this Bin Laden guy, he's still running around.
Right.
So I went over there having an understanding based upon where I was at about how bad things were going, being able to read the, kind of unfiltered intelligence from people I knew over there. I saw the way people were being harmed. but I didn't want to miss it. And I didn't want to miss it. And I wanted to take part and I wanted to get that experience. And then again, I'm a junior guy. And I actually went over the first time on a diplomatic team. So, another thing that just shows you how naive and how stupid we often are. In the summer of '03 was when I had to decide, am I going to stay in the Marine Corps or not? And at that point, I'd been in for 5.5 years, I guess. And I never really saw myself as becoming a colonel or something. And the main thing about Anuj was like those of us who, so the way it works in the military and in the Marine Corps as an officer, you do 3 years in what we call the fleet, the operating forces. So you're with the units, and then you do 3 years administrative, right? So you go and you work in an office job like me at the Pentagon, or you go on recruiting duty, or you go to a school and you teach something or whatever, right? And those are called B billets. Navy calls them shore tours. And so most of my friends actually from my peer group that I had gone through officer candidate school with, and what we in the Marine Corps we call the basic school, were all in B billets like me, right?
Okay.
Except for one buddy of mine, a guy named Chris Hepler, who was, for some reason, was still in his unit. And he was going over there. He'd send us emails from the ship, it'd be like, subject line would be draft dodgers, and he'd say stuff like, hey, I'm bringing a camera with me over to the war so that, I'll take some pictures. When I come back, I'm happy to give them to you so that you can show your grandkids what it looked like to be a Marine in a war. Right. Because the idea was that we missed it, that this thing was going to be over quick. And I'm sitting in the Pentagon in the summer of '03, and I'm seeing this stuff coming out of the Secretary of Defense office from the Joint Chiefs saying, look, by the fall, we're going to be down to 35,000 troops or whatever they were saying, right? Adamant about it. The Marine Corps is saying, we're not going back. These Marines are coming out now. They're the last who are going to Iraq. So I really did feel like I missed it and everything else. So what occurs is I'll get off active duty in April and I'll go into reserves and I'll get a job or whatever. I was interested in going to commercial construction. And at that time, though, a friend of mine had been sent down to Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, which was the Department of Defense organization that administered Iraq for the first 16 months or so of our occupation, essentially colonial administration. And my buddy had been sent there to do HR. And he said, look, we've got a lot of stuff over there. If you're interested in going over as a DOD official, I can get you to go over there. And I said, I'd be interested. That'd be great. I'd love to take part. And this is where the naivety really comes in for me, because even at this point, even because starting to get in '03, you're starting to see some pretty serious battles, Najaf, Samara. Then, so, by April, you have the first battle of Fallujah. You have, at that point, the Abu Ghraib stuff is coming out. It's clear there's no weapons of mass destruction, right? So why the heck would I want to get involved in that? Particularly when I wasn't even certain this was the right thing to do in the first place,
Right.
But there was, again, that desire. What do I know? I'm a junior guy, but I also had I think this gets more back to kind of bigger things you want to talk about, this belief that I could be a moral actor, right? And this is where I was probably the most foolish, I shouldn't say most, I've been foolish a lot in my life, but right. I mean, where I thought I could go over there and in my circle around me, I could be a moral actor, right? Which is just not possible. In war makes you an agent of its immorality. You have no agency in war, whatever you think. And there's a great example of this. One of the best things you can watch about the Iraq War is on HBO. It's called Generation Kill. It was based upon a book by a Rolling Stone reporter who recently passed away, whose name I'm blanking on right now, who was embedded with Marines as they invaded Iraq. And there's a scene in this, and this I think is the best explanation of what war is like, even when you think you've got the white hat on, even when you're trying to be the good guy, right? Even when you think you're there to help the people. The Marines get hit by a Marine unit gets hit by a suicide bomber in a car someplace, or a car bomb goes off or whatever. And so a vehicle comes up and they shoot up the car, right? And they kill a whole bunch of obviously civilians in the car, right? So they say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to next time, and one of every 4 Marines has a grenade launcher under his rifle, right? This little shotgun looking thing that fires a 40 millimeter grenade. And you can fire grenades, you can fire smoke grenades, you can fire flares, whatever. So the thing is that, okay, next time a car starts coming up like that, we'll fire a warning shot with a flare. In this way, the car will stop. If they don't stop, we know they're up to no good, right? And we can shoot them. And so first time it happens, the car comes, the Marine fires that flare. The flare hits the deck, or excuse me, I'm talking about the Marine Corps, so I'm using nautical terminology, right? It hits the ground, right? Bounces off the ground and hits an old man in the back of the head and kills him. That is what war is like. That's what war is like. Even though you think you're doing the right thing, even though you think that you are doing everything you can not to cause harm, that you're being as moral as possible, it doesn't matter. The war is going to make you its agent, and you're going to be a participant in its immorality. And so when I went there in Iraq, I went to Iraq in the spring of 04. I went there as a Department of Defense civilian officer. And, I get there to even play up on like how naive and foolish it all was. My role was to work with the Iraqi Ministry of Youth and Sport. And the whole purpose was I was going to have a $20 million program, supposed to go around the country and help the Iraqis rebuild soccer fields and community centers and gymnasiums and things like that, right? Arenas and whatnot. And I wasn't there very long before they said, this program's not going to work. We need the money for security, and we're going to put you over here. And that they moved me then to another office, and I went north to Tikrit, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown. And there were supposed to have been like 15 other people who showed up to work with us, and no one ever showed up. So I was a 31-year-old guy. I was essentially the American civilian officer in charge of reconstruction in 4 provinces north of Baghdad as a 31-year-old. Like, what the hell did I know? This was, there's so many reasons why this thing was doomed. That's a good example of why it was doomed. Doomed from the onset, never going to work anyway. But just, but even too, then you saw like with that $20 million, I saw it get transferred directly to an Iraqi political party called SCIRI. They have a different name now, which I can't remember, but Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. They're an Iranian-based group that came in and took power because of our invasion. And people may be familiar, of course, with their militia. Their militia is called the Badr Corps. And so $20 million buys a lot of rifles, a lot of RPGs. And the Badr Corps, of course, they were on our side, but the atrocities that they committed against Sunnis and others, massive, as well as fellow Shia, massive. And I saw that money just get written off to them, $20 million in cash given to them. Right. And the thing about it, just to put one more layer on this, right? So the complexity of all this, I'm trying to give an idea of all the different ways the harm, the immorality, the corruption, the rot, the disgrace of war just works on so many interconnected levels. What happens in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, as people, I think, well understood, it's a tremendous amount of money was made, tremendous amount of profits were made. Particularly in the early days, a lot of it was just outright theft. People just think, because we had all this money in cash. When I go north to run this reconstruction program, one of the programs I have is a $50 million program, cash program. The most I ever had in my possession at one time was $26 million. I had $26 million in cash, all $100 notes, right out of the Federal Reserve, sequentially numbered, right? Vacuum sealed bags, that kind of thing. Yeah, I kept them in safes in my bedroom, up a degree, but that 10 million, that money I'm talking about down in Baghdad, there are Americans who pilfered from it. The guy who was in charge of that apartment down there, a guy named Munzer Fat, he had come out of the Balkans. And I learned this from other people who were there doing development and humanitarian work and things like that, that the Balkans were the breeding ground, the proving grounds for this post-conflict humanitarian assistance, right? We're going to come in and we're going to rebuild the bridges that were blown up. The money making, the profit taking, the theft that occurred in the Balkans set up these organizations and individuals for massive success in Afghanistan and Iraq. So what you saw a lot of the people who were populating those early governing authorities in Iraq came out of roles in the Balkans. And some of them, I don't want to disparage all, because some of them were really great people, well-intentioned, everything else. A lot of them were crooked. And you saw this. And so, on all levels, right? That whether it's the violence, the corruption, the harm, it just reinforces itself. And so that's what my initial, experiences at war were very early on.
So let me ask you, I like the way that you actually put that war, it makes you an agent of its immorality. But I want to ask you a very naive question, I guess, in that context. In the context of looking at all of these different players around the world, right? Between Yemen and Israel and Palestine and Syria and Iran, Iraq, if you look at Russia and Ukraine, and then the role that the United States and NATO and the UK all have in this. Are there any good guys in this story that we try to tell ourselves about why these wars are happening?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's a very subjective one, and I think that's Noam Chomsky talks about this, about the danger of looking at intentions in order to try and understand a conflict, because everyone has good intentions, right? I mean, like the intentions of Al Qaeda, of Bin Laden, his lot, were to rid the Muslim people of despotic rulers who were kept in place by foreign powers, right? That's their intention.
Right.
Right? I mean, look at the hijackers, 9/11. They clear their three things were: one, Israelis, U.S. support for Israel, in particular what Israel's doing to the Palestinians and the Lebanese. Muhammad Atta, the leader of that gang, right? When Operation Grapes of Wrath occurs, which was an Israeli assault in Lebanon, 96 or 97 or so, when that occurs, he says, "I'm giving my life to Al Qaeda," right? He had hundreds and hundreds of people massacred by the Israeli army. That's what makes Muhammad Atta say, "I'm going to fight this," right? The other two of the three was the fact that U.S. forces were in Saudi Arabia, in the Holy Land. Okay. I mean, like if you can understand people being angry and upset about that, right? And then the
Right.
third one is the U.S. sanctions and bombing of Iraq. The sanctions were killing thousands of people in Iraq, following the first American Iraq War. And then the bombing, people forget, during the Clinton administration, the United States is bombing. It came out to like every third or fourth day, the United States was bombing Iraq during the Clinton administration. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
okay, this is the same thing too. I alluded to this before, but every now and again, well, not every now and again, we capture fighters who come from Tunisia or Saudi Arabia or Syria or wherever in Iraq to fight us. And when they would be interrogated and asked and tortured, but by the Iraqis, of course, and also by us if we sent them to Abu Ghraib or some of our black sites. But why did you come to fight us? Because of what you're doing here, because you're occupying these people, because I saw the videos on YouTube, right? I
Right.
saw the videos. I mean, so the intentions, and we can make example after example after example. So it's very subjective, right? And it's that old saw, right? It's that old adage that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right.
I mean, so I think you look at the principles, and maybe if you try and apply the principles to international law, and again, I'll cite Chomsky. Chomsky looked at this and he felt that the only just war waged offensively was the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia to destroy the Khmer Rouge, because people are familiar with that. Khmer
Right.
Rouge killed a quarter of their own people. I mean, horrible, right? So I think if you try and apply maybe the principles of international law to this, I think that's where you can get to a degree of objectivity, right? And particularly the willingness or the right of a people to resist. So you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'll say adamantly, yes, the Palestinians are the good guys. Do horrible things happen? Is Hamas anything I would support? I mean, I say, no, but that's war, and that's what you're going to get.
Right.
But in general, like the look at what's occurring here and the right to resist, both from international law and from a natural law perspective as well, the right of human beings not to be occupied, to be free, right, not to be subjugated. So you can apply the same thing to Ukraine, right? And I'm clear in my views on what I think should happen with the Ukraine-Russian war, and certainly I get mischaracterized very often as being pro-Russian because I argue for negotiations, because it's a war that I believe Ukraine can't win. But do Ukrainians have a right to fight the Russians? Absolutely. Did Russia commit a violation of international laws? Are the Russians the bad guys in this? Yes, absolutely. Now, is it complicated? Now, is this a longer story? Did it start on February 22nd, 2022 or February 24th, 2022? Right? No. Did what's happening in Israel, Palestine start on October 7th, 2000? No. Right? I mean, September 11th, was that? But that's another issue is, well, okay, what's your start date for history? And if you sign a certain date, you can make it sure as hell seem as if somebody is clearly a bad guy, somebody is clearly a good guy. When you look at, say, the Afghan war and you say, well, look, Al-Qaeda attacked us, and et cetera, and the Taliban were hosting them, and you don't get into any nuance of that and actually realize the Taliban hated Al-Qaeda and et cetera,
Right.
that the Taliban had no knowledge of what Al-Qaeda was going to do. They didn't have any forewarning or anything like that. you start getting into the history, and why does Al Qaeda exist? Why does the Taliban exist? Oh, we were funding their grandfathers before the Soviet Union's even invaded in order to try and bait the Soviet Unions into Afghanistan to give them their own Vietnam. And that's not me speaking that. That's what Zbigniew Brzezinski said, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. That's what Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense and director of CIA, who at that time in the late 70s was head of the Soviet Union desk at the CIA. That's what they were doing. Okay, so who are the bad guys here? Who are the good guys? Right? So in the sense of Ukraine, say the Ukraine war, if you know the war is not winnable, if there's nothing that can be done to remove the Russians from Ukrainian territory, then why do you persist with it? Why do you allow hundreds of thousands of men on both sides to be killed? For what? Particularly when there are opportunities to negotiate. The Russians have been clear about that.
This is another thing I've reflected on, I think, way more often than I would like to have in the last couple of years. When a natural disaster happens, a tsunami, an earthquake, some crazy freak storm, something that's, an act of God or an act of nature, and it has a significant impact on human lives, on infrastructure, millions of people are displaced, people die and whatnot. That happens, but it was outside of our control, and it's a tragedy, and it's sad, and we should do everything that we possibly can as human beings to help those people.
Right.
But at least it was not in our control. And then I think about war, and I think about the fact that I don't know what the most recent counts are out of Ukraine, for example, but if they've lost 500,000 men, plus civilians, and there could have been a negotiation a year ago, a year and a half ago, 3 days after the invasion. And if at some point, some cohort from Russia and the US and Ukraine actually get to a table and negotiate some sort of a settlement, the war is over basically with the push of a button, right? Sending one email, signing one piece of paper. And that could have happened at any time. And when I think about that, as much as I want all of these conflicts to end, I also think that that's incredibly just heartbreaking, because the only reason that a person or a city or town lived or died is because someone else was unwilling to have that conversation, was unwilling to just meet with somebody else and just sign a piece of paper. And it was so controllable, and it feels like it's in such vain, like so unnecessary. And even if it stops, definitely a war that drags on for 10 years is worse than a war that goes on for 5. But however long it drags on, it was ultimately in the hands of a handful of people to stop it, and they didn't.
Right.
And I find that I don't know what to do with that. It's one of those things that's been bothering me for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the case, I think, for many wars. Say the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. I forget who it was, put up a list of 25 people who these people weren't in Washington, D.C., the Iraq War wouldn't have happened. And that's essentially the case. Again, this idea of what motivates these wars, or if it's political. With the Ukraine war, and this is something that goes back, decades, of course, right? And the Russians view the Ukraine war, as a necessary war. They view it as a preventive war, because in a war of their choosing, as opposed to a war later with NATO, which they genuinely fear. We might look at this and say they're crazy. We're not going to go to war with them. But that's what they genuinely fear. This goes back for the Russians to Charles XVI invading from Sweden, right? And like in all the other invasions, right? So including an American invasion after the First World War, we tried to intervene in their civil war, on both coasts. We had American soldiers both in Western Russia and in Eastern Russia, trying to intervene in their civil war, along with the whole other nations. So it's the perspective. It's how are people viewing this? And then we also, I think, the other thing I think we troubles us is you and I look at it from our perspective, particularly as rational thinkers, as people imbued with principle, as people with an understanding of how the way things ought to be, right? So the very often the idea that nations will pursue interests that are for the best general interests of their nation is a thought that it very often fails when we examine it, right? In a sense of why were certain things pushed? Why did certain nations? And very often it comes down to personal or institutional reasons. Certainly I could take the Iraq War in many reasons for why the United States invades Iraq. And, for some, I really do believe everything I've read and researched. And my boss, a guy named Dennis Fritz, just published a book this past year on it called Deadly Betrayal. But, you look at the various reasons that the various key people in the Bush administration had for wanting that war, and some of them overlap, but a lot of them are different. It's like the idea of like a family deciding where to go to dinner. And the father wants to go to this
Mm,
place because the steak, the mother wants to go to this place because of the, salmon. The daughter wants to go because the, dessert's good. The son wants to go because the waitresses are good looking, I mean, whatever
right.
but you all end up coming to this point. Well, let's go to that restaurant then.
But
And,
in this case, the war becomes a buffet of
it,
benefits, of various benefits for different stakeholders that
It
they
it
all
does.
kind of
I
align
I
on.
think yeah, I think for George W. Bush, you have, he really desires to see democracy. He really believes in this idea of spreading democracy. He really does. Cheney, I think it's about the money to be made, about the Halliburton contracts, and about the power of the
Right.
executive doing what they need to do. Also to ensuring reelection. I think Cheney was big on that as well. You go over to the Defense Department, and a lot of it is this, what comes out of what's called the Project for a New American Century and their clean break strategy that was issued in the 90s about remaking the Middle East in order to ensure Israeli primacy there. So we're going to go and we're going to do regime change in these countries in order to, however you want to describe it, make Israel the most dominant nation, safeguard Israel, however you want to describe it. That was the idea. But there's also times misconceptions. Certainly, if you go back to say Afghanistan and why did the Soviets invade in December of '79, and you can go and look at this stuff at the National Security Archives at George Washington University, the deliberations of the Politburo during that time, and there becomes an inertia that builds. And it
Mhm.
politically is the best thing to do for a host of reasons. One of the reasons that you see in the Politburo discussions about invading Afghanistan is this idea that, well, the US just lost its ally, Iran. And so if we don't go into Afghanistan, the US is going to go into Afghanistan because they need to make up for the loss of their ally, Iran. They need those bases, everything
Right.
else. So if we don't go into Afghanistan, the Americans will, which is just absolutely inane. Like there's no record of evidence or a thought ever that the United States in 1979, because Iran was lost, was going to go into Afghanistan, but the Soviets believed it. Right. And
Right.
then there are other factors. And in this really, you get to this point where there's this meeting, but in the Politburo in February of 1980, after they've been there for essentially a month and a half, maybe, and they're all looking around at each other saying, what the hell happened? How did we get there? How did we get, we're on our way to having 100,000 troops there. I think they had probably 50,000 at that point, right? What the heck
Right.
happened? Right. You know what I mean? So like, there is also time and inertia that comes from the needs of the empire, if you will. And so I think one of the things that we are very reluctant in the US to describe or to understand or to accept is the United States is an empire. If you look at what are the four lines of empire, right? Military, economic, political, and ideological, religious, information, et cetera. And we certainly have all those. We've got 750 bases around the world. Economic wise, we wrote the economic world order in 1944.
Right.
Right. That bleeds into the political aspects of institutions where we either have a control over the United Nations through our veto at the UN Security Council, or we control institutions such as the IMF or the World Bank. And of course, the ideological, which I think most people would say is the most important, or the theological or the information. Yeah, look at Hollywood. Look at the
Right.
fact that the United States is the leader of the free world, right? And so you look at the totality of it, and clear the United States is the world's empire. And so if you then say Emperor Trump, right? All of a sudden now, taking Greenland starts to make sense, right?
Mhm.
You say
Right. Yeah.
Emperor Biden, right? Okay, why are we pursuing this policy of pushing and shoving Russia, right? What sense does that make to us? But you say Emperor Biden, right? You say Emperor Trump, right? Makes a lot more sense, because you're looking at it with a
Right.
different lens, and now you have different expectations. And now you start to understand, again, getting to this point of intentions, you start to understand what are their intentions. And with the American foreign policy and the American presidencies, I go back to George Kennan, who's State Department officer, very famous. He was the man who wrote the containment strategy for the Soviet Union following World War II. But around 1947 or so, he writes a memorandum to President Truman. And he says, essentially, the United States has 55% of the world's wealth, and we have less than 5% of the world's population. The obligation and duty of every successive administration from here on out is to maintain that inequality, right? And so that's an imperial policy. That's an imperial
Right.
necessity, right? I mean, so I think a lot of it, when you get back to this idea, are there good guys, which is an incredible question to ask, you know?
Right.
And I think then that ties into, we were talking before about moral injury, about veteran suicide, about the guilt, shame, regret, all of that. Growing up, we thought we were the good guys. And particularly people
Of course.
people
Yeah.
my generation who watched, grew up, the big film for us in the 80s of that movie Red Dawn. And if people aren't familiar with it, it came
Yep.
out in like 1985 or 86. And the Soviet Union invades Colorado, and these high school kids go up in the mountains and they fight the Soviets, and their high school mascot were the Wolverines. So, that's, right. I mean, so you're
Yeah.
growing up thinking that in the future, you're going to be the Wolverines, right? And then you get to Iraq or Afghanistan. And if you're willing to look at it, because a lot of guys close their minds to it, keep the door closed, don't accept it, right? Which causes other psychiatric problems. And there are, of course, also people who enjoy it, enjoy the power of the psychopath. Look, there's 2.7 million of us who went to Iraq and Afghanistan. So experiences are going to be varied, right?
Right.
But for a big chunk, the idea that we get over there and we're not the Wolverines, we're the Soviets. We're not the guys wearing the white hats. We're wearing the black
Right.
hats, and it becomes actually official policy not to admit that. So it's
Yeah,
not
I'm really
until,
happy you brought that up because empire is actually something I wanted to talk to you about, but because it's a word that is not easily digested by people, right? If you are, it is irreconcilable in your mind to say, I am the empire and I am the good guy. It's those two things are incongruent. And as a slight aside, on a completely different topic, there's a podcast I recently saw, and there's this woman who's, I guess, a communications expert, Van Edwards. She was talking about this game that she had seen the studies of. It was one of these sociology experiments. We brought a random group of people into a sociology experiment and said, we're going to give everybody $100, I believe. And this is the community game. And over the course of playing that game, the people who were playing the community game gave away on average 2/3 of the money that they had. Then they brought in a separate called Wall Street instead of the community game. And in that scenario, she saw, I believe they saw that people were giving away on average 1/3, not 2/3 of their wealth.
right. Yeah.
The only difference there being the word. And that came to mind when I was thinking about what you were saying here with empire, because the words that we use to create that myth. So if we call ourselves the good guys, if we call ourselves the rebels, if we call ourselves the resistance, that carries with it a whole bunch of additional baggage as a shorthand, if you will, on who we believe we are. Now, there may be people who actually don't believe that, but they realize that that set of words will actually motivate a whole bunch of other people to go in that direction like sheep. But ultimately, enough people need to believe that. And the language that we use about ourselves actually really matters. So I'm really glad that you brought that up,
Yeah.
because I found that it's not an easy conversation for people to have.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we called them over there the bad guys, right? The bad guys set up an IED over here kind of thing. Like that's what the parlance we used. Officially in Iraq, we called the insurgents, the resistance, anti-Iraqi forces, AIF. Afghanistan, I think we called them AAF, anti-Afghan forces. I can't remember, but it was that the narrative so it's not until 2005, as far as I can remember, because I remember being struck. I actually remember where I was at the time when I heard we could use this terminology. And it was March of 2005. I was standing in the Tactical Operations Center for the 42nd Infantry Division in Tikrit. And hey, we're allowed to use the word insurgency, right? I mean, so this idea that you couldn't legitimize resistance to our presence, and you'd see it in briefing slides. You go into intelligence briefings, both in Iraq or Afghanistan or in DC, an explanation of, well, why are these groups fighting us? And it'd be, well, they're former regime elements. They're criminal. They're doing it just because the insurgents are paying money. It's ideological. They all believe that they're going to have 72 virgins when they get to heaven. And there would not be national liberation, right? And I remember the resistance in 2009, because what happens when I go to Afghanistan, people don't know, I'm a political officer with the State Department. I see the escalation of the Afghan war. I see that the Afghan war is fundamentally no different than the Iraq war. I was holding on to that it would be somehow different, holding on that the Obama administration would be different than the Bush administration. They weren't. And, this idea that the Taliban, not capital T Taliban, but the kind of the larger movement, were fighting for national liberation or as a continuation of an ethnic civil war, which we had essentially engendered, both of those things were forbidden. You couldn't note that. And mean at the same time, you could look and see how did the Taliban phrase themselves? How did they style themselves? This was a war of self-defense. This is a war of removing occupation. This is a war of national liberation.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw in Iraq as well. So you'd have, to the point, I think, talked about Senator Gillibrand describing, fighters in, or just, she would see, the way she said it was like, so that when soldiers would go to villages looking for terrorists, no, I mean, we know because again, we interrogated these guys, we captured them, we spoke as well, that 97% of the Sunni insurgency, for which there were foreign fighters coming into support through Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other organizations, but 97% of those fighting us were fighting us as a form of national liberation. They're fighting us because we were occupying them. And we
Right.
could not accept that. We would, that type of language. And then this gets into just a very fundamental thing, right? Anuj? If you can't define the problem, how are you going to answer it, right?
Yeah.
If you can't with legitimately or with any degree of integrity or honestly say what is occurring, then what is going to happen? And that's essentially what happens in Iraq in 2006 or 2007, if you remember, with the Sunni awakening. And so for 3 or 4 years, we fought them. We tried to subjugate them. They allied themselves with Al-Qaeda because that's all they could ally themselves with. And then in the fall of 06, we finally talked to them. And we said to the Sunnis, what's going, what are the issues? And they said, well,
Right.
you usurped us. You're occupying us. You've put Shia and Kurdish troops into our cities and villages. We were not partaking in any revenue from the government. We're left excluded, on and on. And we said, okay, what do you want us to do about it? Give us back our towns, our villages, and our land and bring us back into the government. And we did. And what did the Sunnis do? Like literally that day, the Al-Qaeda guys are over there, and, I mean, and so you had that where their grievances were legitimate, absolutely legitimate. And answering those grievances caused that violence in Iraq, in the Sunni parts of Iraq, to drop overnight to almost
Right.
zero levels. Now, of course, there was no long-term solution put into place. And once, particularly after 2011, once the Shia government started preying on the Sunni government again, the Sunnis turned for help. No one was there. Who did they get their help from? Al-Qaeda in Iraq again, but now they're called the Islamic State. And, and then of course you have this terrible, terrible war catastrophe that occurs, occurring in Syria, but then of course in Western and Northern Iraq through, 2017 or so, including genocide, where the Islamists tried to exterminate the Yazidis, Turkmens, others. So,
Right.
I mean, just a basic understanding of what's occurring requires the willingness to be open about what is actually occurring.
Absolutely. I read this saying last year. I don't recall where, but it's been stuck with me in my head that people will see your choices. They won't see your options. And when we look at someone and we say, that's a bad guy, that's a terrorist, that's an insurgent, that's, whatever negative word we want to use to describe them. What we're not necessarily taking into context is what were all of the other options that were put in front of them. Did they lose their family, in the middle of a bombing, right? Did they have any other economic choices, right? What was the card of hands or the hand of cards that was dealt to them in the first place that they
Right.
decided to pick this particular card? And I think that's true for us, no matter who we are, right? We have certain cards that we're dealt, and then we choose to use certain ones, even when we know what the consequences of using those cards will be. We might not be able to foresee every consequence. There's many unintended ones as well. But for the most part, I think if you're about to poke a bear and start a war, you can probably figure out what's going to happen very quickly after that. And someone still made a choice to do that. And
Right.
that's the thing that's the choice that, the opponent, I guess, sees, right? The person that you're fighting, that you're calling a terrorist or an insurgent, is seeing you as having made the choice when you had other choices potentially to still come here and occupy anyways, or whatever the case might be. And, I wonder, I've been thinking about this as well, especially given it was I think a really hot news cycle this week. Looks like there's a ceasefire deal, at least on the table or very close, between Israel and Gaza, although it looks like the Knesset actually pushed off
Yeah.
voting on that. I don't know till when. Biden, I guess, had his last, address to the nation as president. He said something interesting that I thought was kind of ironic. He actually brought up Eisenhower's, the excerpt of his statements about the military industrial complex and the warning to the nation that he made 60 years ago.
Mhm.
So Biden referencing that to me was just a strange irony, like is almost comical in the first place. But then he actually goes on to use that as a springboard to suggest the thing to watch out for today now is the tech industrial
Right.
complex.
Right.
And so it felt like it felt like a strange, almost parody of history. I'm like, what am I actually seeing here? What am I actually hearing? And I wonder from your perspective at this moment in time with the conflicts that are playing out, maybe some are hopefully coming to a close, some are perhaps very much in the middle. When you think about Eisenhower's words from 60 years ago and what you're doing today in the Eisenhower Media Network and what we can learn from that as we move forward, how do we actually approach solutions? Like, what are the steps that we need to take to change this?
Right. Well, I want to go back to your first point, though. You're talking about not understanding what the other options have, because 14 years or so ago, I was on a program with Mullah Zaif. Mullah Zaif was former Taliban minister to Pakistan, and he was talking about fall of 2001. 9/11 happens, and the United States tells the Taliban he had to turn over bin Laden. And Mullah Zaif is telling the Taliban leadership, look, Bush doesn't have much time. You don't understand the American system. The American political system requires him to act right away. He does not have time for us to deliberate. He does not have time for us to do it the way we would do it and make an offer and then come back and everything else. The political forces on him require him to act now. And the fact that he waited until October 7th to launch airstrikes, I think looking back, like, wow, it took that long. And mainly, I guess, for us to get our forces together and everything else. But Zaif was saying essentially what you were saying, but from that perspective, the Taliban didn't understand the Americans. They didn't understand the choices or the options or the pressure that Bush was under. Just in the same way, people will say, well, the Afghan Taliban did offer up bin Laden. They want, et cetera. They offered to surrender, but they did it at their speed, at their pace. People familiar with that type of, it's a trope, but there's a degree of truth to it that, in that part of the world, things move slower and there's a desire to kind of save face, if you will, and other things. And it's a trope,
Right.
but there's elements that are true. And that's what Zaif was talking about, that Zaif was saying. It's like, you guys don't, in the same way we didn't understand them. And so I think that point is really because we're all human beings here.
Well, it feels like the inoculation to that is real diplomacy. And it also
Right.
feels at the same time like real diplomacy has really been cast aside.
Right.
It's there as performative, but real diplomacy, like people actually exhausting every other option besides war and conflict to talk through something. It doesn't feel like that happens nearly as much as it perhaps used to at some point, and certainly not as much as it needs to. I don't know if you share the same feeling about
Oh,
that.
absolutely. And, it's hard to look at it and look at, many of our secretaries of state, whether they've been Hillary Clinton or Mike Pompeo, certainly Tony Blinken,
Mhm.
Antony Blinken, have been more hawkish than the Secretary of Defenses have been. Right. And so you've had, and this is something that I experienced, because what happens is, if for people who are listening, is in 2009, after 5 months in Afghanistan, seeing the escalation of that war, again, no different than Iraq war, I resigned in protest over the escalation of the war, and, becomes a thing. But anyway, in dealing with that, I get to know Ambassador Carl Eichenberry, who's the American ambassador to Afghanistan, as well as Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who's the president's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And, you do hear that within the discussions with the president, and this is also, you can read this in Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, Hillary Clinton was the biggest hawk in the room for escalating the Afghan war. So when you have that type of thing, the same thing too, it's the same way with Tony Blinken when it comes to Ukraine or to Palestine or to China or wherever, when you don't have the voice that's supposed to be the diplomatic voice, and then how does that resonate downwards? And you've seen that shift in the American State Department. My ex-wife was a human rights officer for the State Department, and she was a human rights officer in charge of the South and Central Asia Bureau. So the stands, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, et cetera. That was her area. Bangladesh, Myanmar, right? I mean, so in her last years at state, beginning with the Obama administration, but accelerated dramatically on the Trump administration, her office of 5 or however many human rights officers went down to 1, her, essentially. I mean, and where did these people get moved to? They got moved to political military affairs. And what does political military affairs do? They write some reports and analysis and stuff, but primarily their job is to sell weapons, right? I mean, so you
Right.
see,
Yeah.
right, not just with the ideology, the desire for, but taking part in the war making process, right? Taking part in the overall war machine, if you will. And so that really negates the diplomatic priorities of the State Department. And, so
Yeah.
whether it's the top leadership or whether it's actually happening with mechanics and who's doing what in this at state. Yeah, certainly. I mean, and some of the greatest voices for the State Department have come from the military side. I mean, you've had
Right.
various generals, I think Petraeus, Allen, secretaries of defense like Bob Gates, who have said, the State Department needs more money. I mean, one of them said, I think it was Gates,
Right.
maybe one of them made the point of like, I've got more marching band members than the State Department has foreign service officers, which I think is a true stat. I think there's more members of marching bands in the United States military than there are actually foreign service officers, right? I mean, so yeah, I mean, it is, but it comes back to your priorities, right? And what are the purposes? And there is this,
Absolutely.
right? What are the purposes? And then this gets back to the idea of what are the intentions and the lenses we're looking at it. And if we understand it as empire, certainly it makes sense. One of the other things too, Anuj, is that we've always been at war. This was the great thing about the Cold War for the American empire, right? And maybe let's get to your point about Eisenhower, is that the Cold War allowed for permanent warfare, right? We were
Right.
always in a crisis. It was all, and when it's a crisis, when it's an emergency, when you're up against the other, when you're up against the bad guy, and it's a clear Manichaean tale of good versus evil. We're good, they're bad, et cetera. All the things we've talked about. Well, that makes diplomacy superfluous. We don't have
Right.
time to talk. We're at war. You want to talk with these guys? Didn't you learn the lesson of Munich? Well, I mean, like all that stuff, right? All those denunciations and tropes and mistruths come out to beat down anyone who's raising their hand saying, hey, shouldn't we try and talk to these guys? Well, if we just talk.
Yeah. And yet
yeah.
we've had great examples, if I recall correctly, like Khrushchev and Kennedy had, like direct access to each other. It may not have been the most popular decision with their administrations, but it allowed us to avoid, escalation in the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
Talking, this is actually one of the reasons why I even started this podcast. I think this is one of the reasons why podcasts have proliferated. In the station, in a situation where you have two people, you introduce the risk of conflict of some sort, right? It doesn't have to be violent conflict, but there is some conflict. Now, there's only two paths, I believe, that we have to resolve that conflict. It's either conversation or violence. And violence will happen because we've lost our ability or foregone our ability to have conversation. And I think that happens between, it could be like two brothers, it could be between two groups of people, two tribes, or it could be between two nations or multiple nations. And wherever we've actually really sincerely put our efforts into talking to each other, I think we've done a better job of being able to avoid it. But I've talked about this before. I feel like we talk about plan A and plan B, but we actually put all of our money and our effort and our resources into plan B. So everyone says they want world peace,
Right.
But all of our money is invested against world war, right? Against armaments instead of against diplomacy, instead of conversation and whatnot. So if you put most of your energy, 98% of your energy towards being prepared for war, you have very little resource and mind space and even just intellectual capital left for real conversation. And I think that mind shift, I don't know what the answer to how we actually get society to that mind shift, but I think that is absolutely central to getting us out of this endless cycle of madness.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it certainly, and it gets, I think, well, I want to go back to your point about Eisenhower though. And, because we are the Eisenhower Media Network, and why did we choose that name? There's all kinds of things you can fault Eisenhower for his foreign policy and his love of coups and his embrace of nuclear weapons, all kinds of things like that. But the idea being is that he saw the trade-off early. He understood that you can do one and not the other, that you could either invest in plan A, as you were saying, Anuj, or you're going to go carry out plan B. And, he has it's called the Cross of Iron speech in 52 or 53. And this is where he says, for every bomber built, that means, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but like X amount of schoolhouses that can't be built, right? I mean, the trade-offs
Right.
here culminates in saying, we're witnessing humanity hanging from a cross of iron. I mean, and of course, Eisenhower culminates with his farewell address that I guess President Biden was referencing about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. One of the key things about that address is he describes it as something new. That, he makes it clear that prior to World War II, we did not have a permanent war industry in the United States. And that's the case. That's the truth. Even after World War I, it was vastly decommissioned. And you had efforts in Congress, led by Senator Nye, to make such profiteering from war illegal in the United States. They saw that after the First World War, they saw the amount of money being made off of this, and many recognized the danger in that, as well as just the immorality of it. It's not right. And there were efforts in the United States Congress in the 20s and 30s to prevent that from happening again. They failed, of course. And then what you have in the Second World War, we have this massive, massive buildup to the military industry in the United States, is that we can't let that go. People are doing too well off of this, right? And so the need to continually fund that at the expense of everything else. And that's what you're seeing. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of that backlash. If you see on social media this past week, as the fires are destroying Los Angeles, certainly I've been in North Carolina. I mean, the wreckage of Hurricane Helena 4 months later, however long it's been now, October. It is just, it's going to take years and years to rebuild. People have lost everything out there, and there's not enough money. One of the things I was using as a number last year was at some point in early December, I think it was the state treasurer, I can't remember, one of our officials here in the state government in North Carolina said, this is what we're looking at in terms of money for Hurricane Helena recovery. And we're expecting to get $7 or $8 billion from the federal government. We can expect to get $6 or $7 billion from insurance companies. We have about $4 or $5 billion in the state we can use, but we're $36 billion short of what we think we'll need to rebuild Western North Carolina. And you go back and then you look at this last year's defense budget, and there's $38 billion in that for weapons that the Pentagon didn't even ask for, right? I mean, and then you can pick and choose whatever you want. I mean, certainly a year back in August, when it was a year of the Maui fires, of which there's still more than 10,000 people out there who are living in shelters, by understanding, and the shortfall that exists with that. There's still about a $10 billion shortfall, at least as last August. And I don't know how much money was appropriated for it, but, we're talking, people are seeing that trade-off. But then the money that gets sent to Israel, the money that gets sent to Ukraine, the money that's, the next generation of bombers for the United States, the B-21 Raider, they're going to cost $2 billion a piece. We're going to buy 100 of those planes, supposedly, and it's a $200 billion program, right? The math works out, right? Our aircraft carriers and our submarines are $13 or $14 billion a piece. I mean, and there's no debate about this. But again, if we go back and you put on the imperial lens, which of course, because we have a very nefarious view of ourselves and of the world, insidious is worse, where our strength comes from military action abroad. Our strength comes from how many weapons we can sail abroad. Our strength comes from having 750 military bases, on and on and on, right? When the reality, where does our strength really come from as a nation? It comes from our people. It comes from our infrastructure.
Yep, absolutely.
Our resources. That's what makes the nation strong. And that essentially, I think, gets to Eisenhower's points, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like you hit something really important there. There's a strange paradox that there's always money to bomb the schools and bridges of others, and never enough money to build our own schools and bridges. Right. And I do believe, caught up in, the decisions and the actions of a handful of bureaucrats and leaders and technocrats, and profiteers, is the average person. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate about the veil of how the American story in particular is told to the world and to itself is that most Americans are actually just good people that want to live a decent life. They put their kids through school, maybe have a house and a yard and a dog, just live peacefully. I mean, obviously in every society, you're going to have people that are across the spectrum, very different. But generally speaking, people in America, as anywhere else, just want to live in peace. They're just
Right.
good people that are kind of held hostage by leaders that have completely different interests. And you see this more and more, especially being, Canadian and being here in Toronto and seeing the US media coverage kind of from the outside. Like we kind of see it,
Yeah.
we're a little bit arm's length, so we can see it from a slightly different perspective. It's hard not to sympathize with this idea that how can there not be money for infrastructure? How can there not be money to fight fires? How are you running out of water in a state like California, which has a bigger GDP than most countries on the planet? How are these things even possible? And yet, as the world's de facto reserve currency, there's an endless supply of money to be able to
Right.
print, but it's always deployed to things that are generally net negative, not net positive. And I guess in that context, doing what you do and being the person that you are with the story that you're carrying with you, what gives you hope? What inspires you? Like what keeps you going every day to fight this fight?
Oh, I get criticized a lot because I am very pessimistic. Like I wasn't the ceasefire deal that, as we speak right now is being held up and is really political issues, domestic political issues, which I don't know why people didn't identify in the last couple of days and say, wait, hang on, nobody celebrate yet because it's got to get through the Israeli government. And, there's all kinds of stuff there. And what leverage do we have on the Israeli government in terms of its domestic politics? We have very little, whether it's Trump or Biden. We have
Right.
a tremendous leverage on its military operations, but very little in terms of playing a role in their domestic politics. It's really the Israeli-American relationship is really remarkable. And it is such an outlier in terms of how an empire is normally constructed or normally functions. But in terms of, so I'm generally pessimistic. I've got to do a webinar tonight about the coming year in Palestine and my assessment. Anyway, so yeah, hope is, I think hope is different for many people. I could make that kind of caveat. For me, it's about necessity, and it's about there is no alternative. And for me, some of it is backwards looking in terms of, again, as we talked at the beginning about this, my morality of anger and guilt, right? I mean, of trying to make up for what happened because my anger at our government and at the people who are in power, like the people who are in power now, the same people that were,
Right.
gave us all these, right? I mean, and coming into power with the Trump administration, he's got a few people from the outside, but they all agreed with that stuff anyway. It's all the same people, and my anger at that. And also too, that my understanding of where will this go? Best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? I
Right.
mean, what do you think is going to happen? So that's a lot of it for me. And so it becomes an act of I try not to let it be righteous because that's what it can become. And that then of course is very dangerous. And then if I'm righteous, how different am I than Pete Hegseth, right? In his righteousness, right? And certainly for my work as being an analyst, that's not any good. And I've got to try being objective as possible. But the idea of hope though is I think there is no alternative. There is no other option, and that we do this for those we love. And when I was in Palestine in November, and I spoke with a woman, she's actually she was the lead researcher or the lead author for the Amnesty International report that came out late last year, saying what's occurring here is a genocide. And she talked about radical acts of hope. And I said, can you define that? What are radical acts of hope? And this is heartbreaking. And she described, the farmers in Gaza who still go out in the fields to try and get food, and the Israelis murder them. The fishermen who still go out to sea to try and get food, and the Israelis murder them. The municipal workers who are trying to get the water turned back, trying to stop the sewage from spreading, and the Israelis murder them. The teachers who are still teaching the children and who are being murdered. Those are her radical acts of hope. And the macabre aspect of hope in that, of course, is right there. But what other choice do they have? And so for me, it's not so much about hope. It's about this is a necessity, that there is no alternative. And that, even if we don't succeed, at least we go down swinging. So the idea of not bending a knee to something that we know is wrong, and for me, of
Right.
course, I'm certainly self-aware as we have this conversation about how it comes across as being, doing things to try and atone and because of guilt. And I understand how people could be, what they think when they hear that, but that's one part of why I do it. I'm aware of it and everything else. So, but the other aspect of trying to prevent it from happening again, as well as trying build something that is a better alternative, that is something that will respond to the needs of the American people, that will lead to a more peaceful world. So I saw this thing about and the unwillingness to live in a society like this. I saw some, with this whole nonsense, this craziness with TikTok. And I think it's so great that people are just going on to other Chinese apps, right? That people
Red
are
One, I
downloading
think is what it's
Lemonade
called or something.
and
Yeah.
Red Note. Yeah, Red Note's the big
Yeah.
one.
Red Note.
And I saw I saw a screenshot this morning. Someone, and you hear these stories now. In the last week, I saw something about how the 2025 trend nobody saw coming: white women learning Mandarin. Right, all these people who were TikTok users who are now jumping on Red Note, and I guess the Red Note, I'm sure they're working on it very heavily right now, but I guess the translation is not automatic, and there's so people are
You
like
have to
taking
change
stuff.
the settings to English. The default
Yeah,
is
it's
Mandarin, and I
not,
think there's other
yeah,
things too.
it's not, yeah, it's not, yeah, but there's this thing, there's this commentary out there about how people actually are starting to try or wanting to learn Mandarin now or whatever. And then, but the bigger thing is that they're talking to Chinese folks. And this screenshot
Mm.
today was a question in the comments from a Chinese person to an American saying, "Is it true that you have to pay for your ambulance service?" I think I believe that's just or is that just propaganda from my government? Right? I mean, like, we have a
Wow.
society that is so on the other side of the rest of the world, right? This basic precept that someone who's
Mhm.
hurt shouldn't be able to be cared for by society is alien to the structure of the United States. It's only going to get worse with this kleptocracy that's coming into power now, right? So, you see that, and it's just, it really jars you that what alternative we have to do something,
Right.
So, that motivates a lot of it. And the hope, the hope is where I do get hope though, is because they're trying to ban TikTok. It scares them. Information scares them. Dialogue scares them.
Mhm.
Connection scares them. And you see, it's just not the Republicans trying to ban TikTok or not. It's Democrats. It's both of them. There was
Right.
early March or so of last year, probably at like Aspen Security Festival or one of those horror shows. You had Mitt Romney speaking with Tony Blinken, and they're talking about TikTok, and they were very clear. The danger of TikTok is that we can't control the information. Right? I mean, there's other factors too. They don't like TikTok because it's a foreign company making money that they believe American companies should be making.
Right.
And this gets, I think, maybe to Biden's point about the danger of a tech oligarchy. But that's a symbiotism with government. There, you're talking about, just like Eisenhower
Right.
talked about the
Right.
military-industrial complex. He originally called it the military-industrial congressional complex, and his advisor said, "Take congressional out. We don't want to start a fight with these guys as you're walking out the door." And so you have also as well, the fact that the American intelligence services can't get into TikTok as they can get into
Don't have the
Facebook.
backdoor access. Right.
Exactly. And so, what I mean?
Yeah.
But the big thing is the information control. And that scares them. And it's stuff that you're doing. It's independent media, right? It's alternative media, whatever you want to describe it. It's this technology allows us to talk like this. Even 5 years ago, it may not have worked that well, right?
Right.
Before the pandemic, like we could have done this, but we may have had some problems, or certainly, but now this is, and so understanding that's what gives me hope, because you see their fear, right? You see how they react to it. Okay, this is something, because we have to fight this empire. We have to fight this
Right.
establishment, this oligarchy, however you want to describe it, asymmetrically. There's two things I refer to all the time. One is actually supposedly a saying that Joe Biden used to say. I knew a member of the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he used to say all the time, "Don't die on a small cross." And something I would, so pick your battles wisely. The other one,
Okay.
though, germane to this, is I don't know if you're a South Park fan.
Oh yeah, loved South
Okay.
Park.
You go back 20 years or so, and there was like a South Park episode where the parents were all upset at the school about something, right? And
Yeah.
so they strap themselves in the catapults and they fling themselves
Yeah.
against the
Oh
brick
my
wall,
God. Yeah, I
right?
love
They
that
hit the
one.
brick wall
Yeah.
and then they slide down it, right? A
They're
bloody mess.
sliding down.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So don't catapult yourself against the brick wall, right? And so don't die on a small cross. I mean, and so it's all about what resources do we have and how do we fight this Leviathan asymmetrically, right? Don't fling ourselves against brick walls. And so I think that's what this is. This technology, the stuff that you're doing, Anuj, scares them. And we have to be careful because they have ways to, they have they're banning TikTok, but also too, look at who's going to be sitting alongside Donald Trump's cabinet at his inauguration on Monday.
Right.
Jeff Bezos is going to be up there, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, right? So these men in their institutions or their corporations are in at what C. Wright Mills called the power elite that runs the empire. And so you
Yeah,
have,
and ironically dressed as arbiters and protectors of free expression and
that's
speech.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
It's
Right.
like you had to sugarcoat like that really sour pill to be
Right.
able to sell it through. And in this case, it's being expressed as freedom of expression.
Right. Exactly.
Matt, you have been incredibly gracious with your time, and I'm humbled and thankful that there's people like you doing what you do. I found a lot of value in actually just being able to point my attention at certain things happening in the world just by following some of the things that you're looking at and writing about. So where can people find out more?
Well, thank you. I appreciate news. I'm on Twitter or X, Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name's H-O-H. I'm on Instagram as well, same thing. And then certainly my organization is called the Eisenhower Media Network. Just Google that. And of course, I'm on Substack as well. Matthew Hoh on Substack or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'll put all the
something like
links.
that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put all the links for everyone to come check out. I
Appreciate
hope
it.
that we can do this again. I hope that we can do it in a time when we've moved the needle a little bit further in the right direction. But thank you again, Matt. This has just been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. You're welcome. I enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
All right, we're out.